Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for an event today where we're going to do our best to unpack and cover two recent significant world events and summits and discuss what they mean for Ukraine in their continued fight against Russian aggression. Our event title really sums it up. So our panel is called What the War in the Middle East and the NATO Summit Mean for Ukraine. We've got an excellent panel here today to cover these issues. It's my pleasure to introduce them. We're joined today by Deborah Kagan, Senior Advisor to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Luke Coffey, Senior Fellow at the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, R. Clark Cooper, a Distinguished Fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East Programs, and last but not least, Ambassador Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We're going to start off with our panelists for a moderated discussion, and then we'll move to audience questions at the end. So if you have a question at any time, hard or easy, you can pitch them to our panel at askac.org. And again, that is askac.org. So Mr. Cooper, we will start with you. What is the impact of US and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities? What is Iran's ability to project power like now? And where is its current position in the Middle East as a regional player?
Well, let's start with the strikes. So the spring strike by the Israelis, that preemptive strike, and then the significant U.S. strike, those disrupted the immediate capacities for Iran to develop nuclear weapons and develop their program. However, it does remain uncertain as to whether that action or those actions will effectively really deter Iran's regime to pursue nuclear capabilities. I mean, this is the point. Yes, those strikes were very, very significant. However, even today, as we have this conversation, the full BDA or the battle damage assessment, that's not yet fully complete by our intelligence community as well as our partners and allies who are working with us on this. So we don't have a real truthful scope about the destruction or some would say degradation of Iran's capabilities. So the regime has appeared to have been given two choices before these strikes. It was either abandon their nuclear ambitions or aspirations or face a lack of intervention from the Trump administration when we're talking about the Israeli strikes this spring. And that is exactly what did occur. Now, when one looks at Iran's ability to still project power after these strikes, yes, these were decisive strikes, but the regime still has some options. The retaliatory options are few. There are degraded capabilities, but they still have proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Those are still existent entities out there. And even the regime's immediate response, though limited, remember, they had a declaration after the strike that every American in the Middle East is a target. But that remains a regional focus when you look at it that way. So if you want to look at it very pragmatically, they're still remaining regionally focused on retaliation. An example, if we just look back at May, the U.S. and the Houthis in Yemen had agreed to a ceasefire that neither would target each other. However, the Houthis have now made it clear post-strike that they will target U.S. ships in the Red Sea, with the U.S. becoming involved in the Israeli attacks on Iran. So overall, while it's doubtful Iran would ever submit to U.S. conditions on ceasing nuclear enrichment, and that still seems to be the case, it is a significant relief that there is, for now, what seems to be a measured degradation of their capabilities. But as I said, the full battle damage assessment is yet to be out there.
Thank you very much. Very useful. Now, Ms. Kagan, let's tie in Russia. We know that Russia and Iran have collaborated militarily, a trend which increased after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What has Iran received from Russia in exchange for weapons? And since US strikes against Iran's nuclear program, Russia only provided political support to Iran. Why is this? And what has this done to Russia's reputation in the Middle East?
Thank you for an excellent question and good day to everyone. I think this is interesting. I think I'm going to take a little stroll down history lane here of what happened in 1982, and I think Clark knows where I'm going with this. So after the Israelis decimated every surface-to-air missile that Syria had in the Bekaa Valley in southern Lebanon, Russia turned around because their reputation was mud at that point, and they turned around and they gave Syria the SA-5, which was then the sexiest, most efficient surface-to-air missile in the inventory. And very dangerous because its altitude and its target acquisition meant it could take down civilian aircraft going into and out of Israel and other places. And I believe, and people might disagree with me, but I think that started the more sophisticated arms race in the Middle East. Because before then, the equipment that Russia was providing and we were providing was not the best of the best. But after that, there was a decision made, and the then Russian chief of this general staff, like a fellow named Ogarkov, physically went to Syria on numerous occasions, and all of a sudden, whoop, the SA-5 shows up. So Russia immediately went into its larder and said, okay, we're going to be a big player here, and this is what we're going to do. And that also started setting the groundwork for Russia's supply and support for Hamas and Hezbollah. And in terms of everything from training to equipment to sophisticated ability to target Israeli targets and the like. And so that, of course, went on fast forward into Syria. So I think the reputation for Russia, what's happened to Iran following so closely on the heels of Russia's debacle in Syria is not good for Russia's reputation. In fact, if I'm Hamas and Hezbollah, I'm thinking, oh boy, I need a better person to support me here than Russia. And the fact that Russia's done nothing is also an indication that Russia doesn't have much to give at this point. And I think, and if I can, just one little tangent here, Operation Spiderweb, what we saw then was how the Ukrainians were able to strike Russia's, very effective one leg of their nuclear triad, meaning their air component. And what we also saw was that a lot of the aircraft were not in good working shape either. So it leads one to conclude, at least this one, meaning me, it leads me to conclude that maybe Russia's ability to sustain their nuclear triad at the levels that they would like us to think that they're sustaining is just not a truth here. So I think at this point, this is all Russia can do, is have these meetings in Moscow and meet with these guys, because they don't have much to give. And if they had much to give, they wouldn't be getting weapons from Iraq and from Iran, and they wouldn't be getting weapons from North Korea. So I think the larder is not bare, but it's pretty run down.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Ambassador Herbst, what is the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on President Trump's decision-making regarding U.S. policy toward Ukraine?
Oh, that's a complex question. One, Trump's decisive intervention in Iran sent a shockwave through a portion of his supporters and was something that was not greeted happily by some serious Trump influencers, both on the outside as well as government officials. We know that people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon were vehemently, stridently against. There are reports that the vice president was questionable on this, that Secretary of Defense Hegseth also may not have gone along, and the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, was unenthusiastic. And while I think the vice president tried to demonstrate his loyalty to his boss, there were credible reports that Gabbard and Hegseth were sidelined as Trump made the decision. And we've seen a very interesting effort in Trump world, in the MAGA component of Trump world, to say that Trump's going in for just a one-day strike and then completely pivoting towards a ceasefire demonstrates that Trump is a non-interventionist. They're trying to put their interpretation of international affairs on the president himself, who I don't think is subject to that sort of manipulation. Why am I going through this? Because it has a very clear relevance for American policy. I would say less on specifically Ukraine, but on specifically Russia, with existential consequences for Ukraine. Because Moscow is waging a war of not just conquest, but a war designed to seriously limit if not annihilate, Ukrainian culture, which we see in occupied Ukraine right now. Strong measures taken, for example, prohibiting the use of the Ukrainian language. If President Trump draws what I consider to be the right conclusion from his strong decision, his superb decision on Iran, he will see, just as Iran was playing him, willing to negotiate, but not to make any serious concessions, is exactly what Putin is doing to him now in Ukraine. When Trump became president, in fact, as he won the election, he said that he would bring peace to Ukraine quickly, that he would do that by insisting on concessions from both sides and by using American power to persuade those obstructing peace to make the right decisions. Since the meeting in Jeddah in mid-March with U.S. Ukrainian officials, the Ukrainians said yes to every proposal Trump has made to bring a ceasefire to Ukraine. Russia has rejected every single one, with the exception of the energy ceasefire, which they violated within 2 hours of agreeing to it. What I've just said is well understood in Washington, certainly well understood in Moscow. They're doing it. Yet we have not seen, to this point, President Trump bringing the hammer down on the Kremlin for obstructing his vision of a durable peace. He brought the hammer down on Iran. Some are hoping, and I'm one of them, that he will use the same logic to make the same decision to make sure Russia is pressured to agreeing to peace in Ukraine.
Thank you. Just expanding on that briefly, what would bringing the hammer down look like?
There are two things that are special. Actually, no, three things that are especially important. First and foremost, it's sending weapons to Ukraine. Now there's a Biden pipeline, stuff approved when Biden was president, which is on its way to Ukraine. We saw an unfortunate interruption of that pipeline a couple of months ago, which may have been someone doing mischief in the Defense Department. That's not clear, but that interruption was brief. Let's hope that that pipeline continues to flow. That's very important. But more important is Trump-approved weapons for Ukraine. Now, consistent with President Trump's approach, this does not need to mean an American gift. Europeans will be ready, prepared to pay for it. There could be a loan. This can be paid for without American money. So that's the single most important thing. Second very important thing, which could help pay for this. There are roughly $300 billion worth of frozen Russian state assets in the international financial system. One of the good things Biden did in his last year in office was to come up with a proposal that enabled, from that collateral based on that, to lead to a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. Smart people like Philip Zelikow, Larry Summers, Robert Zoellick, who understand the financial system well, say there's no reason why that money can't simply be somehow sent to Ukraine. That could pay for a lot of weapons. The third thing, of course, are additional sanctions on Russia. Lindsey Graham has had a bill in place since early April. It has 84 Senate co-sponsors. Sadly, the president has not allowed that to move, has not endorsed it. Secretary Rubio, in a statement not very encouraging last week, said, well, we don't want to move that now because the Russians may come back to negotiations. Now, I think Secretary Rubio, who's a very smart man, understands that that's not very good analysis. Because since Putin has said his aim is to establish full control over Ukraine, the only way you dissuade him from that aim is to put pressure on him. And one of the ways you put pressure on him is by moving forward the Graham legislation. So those are three things we can and should do.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Coffey, let's tie in the NATO summit. Can you share your impression of the recent NATO summit and its key results as regards NATO policy toward Russia and Russian aggression in Ukraine? And how could the outcome of the NATO summit impact the conflict in the Middle East?
Thanks, Shelby, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to participate in all this. Greetings to everyone watching online. Look, I think a few years ago, or let's say in Trump's first term, us NATO watchers always got a little nervous when the NATO summit appeared. We never knew what was going to be said, what was going to be done, perhaps which head of government might be pushed out of the way. But Trump has evolved when it comes to these high-level international summits, and NATO is no exception. And I have to admit, I personally went into the Hague summit pretty relaxed. I felt like President Trump was on a high. He had like this bump from what happened in Iran. At first glance, it seemed like everything went well and the mission was very successful. And he received the usual rounds of congratulations from different European leaders, many of whom in the past would have never congratulated President Trump on such an act, but they did so. So Trump was riding high because of that. Then we had the screenshotted posted text messages from the Secretary General to the president that really showed the thinking, at least, of Secretary General Rote when it comes to President Trump's involvement and leadership on the defense spending issue. And then you've had the European leaders figure out a better way to engage with this administration from what we would have seen at perhaps NATO summits during the first Trump administration. So going in, I had a good feeling it would be okay. I didn't have any illusions that it would be a groundbreaking historical summit. It was heavily choreographed. It was a reduced summit. The summit declaration focused on Russia being a threat to Europe, which is fantastic. In fact, you could argue about 1/5 of the summit communique focused on Russia, because there were only 5 small paragraphs and one of them focused on Russia. But compared to previous summit declarations, last year, for example, at the Washington, D.C. summit, there were 38 paragraphs in the summit declaration. So we had a smaller, more narrowly focused summit declaration that everyone could agree to. We had all the correct things said by President Trump at the time when it comes to possibly arming Ukraine, on defense spending, on the importance of Article 5. So overall, I'm happy with it. How will this impact or not impact the current conflict in the Middle East? NATO does have a couple of instruments at its disposal when it comes to engaging with Middle Eastern partners. 2 are the Mediterranean Dialogue, which is the platform NATO uses to engage with countries of North Africa and the Levant, including Israel. And the second one is the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which is the platform that NATO uses to engage more with Gulf states. Neither of these platforms were raised, mentioned, or discussed, at least as far as I know, at the NATO summit. Even last year, which marked the milestone of the 30th anniversary of the Mediterranean Dialogue and the 20th anniversary of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, these platforms really weren't discussed. I think it's time to, in the context of the Middle East, to look at how these platforms can be updated, revitalized, to ensure that there's more NATO engagement. I don't want to say involvement, but NATO engagement with key partners in the Middle East. In one area where I think there could be confidence building, very easy confidence building, would be on air defense. Everyone agrees that we need more air defense capabilities. We're learning a lot of lessons from Ukraine. We're now learning lessons from what Iran's doing in the Middle East. How do we join these issues up to make NATO safer? So I would love to see NATO look at these 2 platforms to enhance its involvement. Not involvement is too strong of a word, perhaps, but engagement. I don't want NATO deploying troops to the Middle East, but I want us to recognize that often what happens in the Middle East can spill over to the transatlantic community, and NATO can work with key partners. I'm hoping that at the summit in Turkey next year, that Ankara will upload this issue to the NATO agenda. Let's see what happens. But other than that, I don't think the summit really had a big impact on the conflict in the Middle East.
Thank you, Luke. Relaxed and happy are not words we hear often in our discussions, so I appreciate that perspective. Before I turn to the next question, I wanted to see if anyone had a reaction to that in particular. Going once, going twice. No, okay. All right. Mr. Cooper, how does Iran view Russia now? US President Donald Trump would like a nuclear agreement and a ceasefire to hold. What are the prospects for these? And do you have any thoughts on Trump's policy going forward towards Iran and Israel?
Well, let's start with Tehran's view of Moscow, right? So it's already been discussed today about, I think Deborah said it best, the lauder being not bare completely, but there's a degradation in what the capabilities or capes are coming out of Moscow. So if we look at 2022, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, arms transfers, tech transfers between Russia and Iran, they increased dramatically. And there's been mutual exchange there on advanced weaponry. There's been the training that's been discussed, drone supplies. There's a number of promises, and this is where we get into where there's some gray space. Planned deliveries of advanced jet fighters like the Sukhoi, right? So planned being the key word here versus like what's actually been delivered. What hasn't changed is the pressing demands by the Russian military for Iranian munitions and drones, particularly for Ukraine. So that is going to continue to ensure a bilateral relationship between those two countries. But the need is seeming more on the Russia side versus what is Iran getting in return. And if we look back even before 2022, overall, there had been critical components in their relationships associated with arms and tech transfer, but always with a little bit of a skepticism or side eye still in place. That's not going to go away. But yes, if one is sitting in Tehran, they are wondering, what is it that Russia is going to eventually be able to provide in a tangible material sense. Now, when we're looking at the nuclear agreement and where President Trump stands, I would say his position hasn't changed since he was first president in 2017. There's always been a consistency of not allowing or not favoring Iran from having capabilities in the nuclear space, regardless if it's civilian nuclear, when this is sometimes debated amongst some in the administration, and or weapons grade. Regardless, the president's had a position of none of that is acceptable. Now, as far as the prospects about an agreement, I'm not even going to get in that analysis because I think it's quite there's a lot of missing components there. But the president's position hasn't changed. Now, on policy, going towards Iran, again, non-nuclear state, non-negotiable, and then policy with Israel. While the president might have been recently tactically irritated with the central government, I want to go back to the 80s. We've already referenced the 80s. What's passed as prologue, what occurred in the Reagan administration matters today. So in 1983, the Reagan administration set up a bilateral agreement with Israel called the Joint Political Military Group, or the JPMG. That forum has been in existence and continued solidly through on combined joint planning of not only exercises and logistics, but also identifying requirements for Israel's sovereign defense. Now, what makes it all fascinating from a NATO component, when we look at the JPMG today in a modern context, most people look at it from a defense from Iran's threats to wipe out the state of Israel. However, the reason why it was created during the Reagan administration was actually to counter, wait for it, Soviet involvement in the Middle East. So when you look at the history of U.S.-Israel policy in the Middle East, much of what we look at on capability provision, FMS, foreign military financing to Israel, all roots back to countering Russia presence and posture in the Middle East. So I love how we've gone full circle today, back to the 80s. But that does inform policy today, and it's the reason why I wanted to at least put that out there, is that JPMG is still a very active implement. When I was Assistant Secretary of State, I had that seat for the U.S., and all of my predecessors did, and successors will. And then we have a counter point, our twin, so to speak, sitting in Tel Aviv at the Israeli Ministry of Defense. That, though very technical, was a policy decision made by the United States decades ago that has evolved over time, but still is rooted in the policy space of the U.S. will defend the sovereignty of Israel. And that will certainly factor into any decisions related to any agreement or disabling of Iran's capabilities.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Ms. Kagan, what role have Iranian weapons played in Ukraine, and what should the U.S. do going forward, considering this collaboration between Russia and Iran?
Thanks for the question. And I have to thank Clark here, because I had promised myself I was going to try to behave today, but you've now opened the doors so wide that I just have to step through them. The first thing I need to say is that Iran's nuclear program never would have had the jumpstart it had without Russia. Russia gave Iran, when Siemens left Bushehr, Russia came in and not only gave Iran nuclear enrichment know-how, they gave them their first centrifuges. And people like to conveniently forget that, but that was done in the 90s. Also, Russia was very active in providing Iran's capabilities and knowledge for ballistic missile technology and for the physics package that goes on that warhead that is fired. And I think people again forget not just the 80s, but what Russia did in the 90s, when supposedly we were, during the Clinton administration, we were supposed to be kumbaya, let's just be friends, etc., whatever 1960s music you want to play to this tune. But it didn't happen. And all the while, Russia helped Iran develop ballistic missile technology. Its missiles were pretty mediocre before then. They had to, they couldn't just, stand and fire. They had to move them to get altitude, to get azimuth, to get everything on their missiles. But Russia helped them improve that. They didn't have that before. And again, they gave them their first centrifuges, which Iranians, not being very dumb, were able to reverse engineer and create, their first attempts at enriching uranium. So I want to put that out there, and thank you, Clark, for opening that door, because that's still going on to this very day. And a lot of Netanyahu's paranoia of not wanting to dismiss Russia when it was performing that JTAC role in Syria, the Joint Tactical Air Control for Syria, was this paranoia that Russia could substantially enhance Iran's ballistic missile, glide missile, supersonic missile technology, and its warhead packages, the physics package that goes into a warhead. So that's the first thing to say, that there's plenty of evil that continued in Russia's support for Iran well beyond its transition from the Soviet Union. The second thing is there is forensic evidence that is piling up daily that the Iranian weapons that first went into, that were used in Ukraine, have had quantitative upgrades and substantial upgrades. Now, we can't confirm every little rumor that's been out there, but we can confirm a couple of them. And these weapons have much more devastating blast effects than they've had in the past. They're more accurate. They're better at avoiding radar and early warning detection. They're better at avoiding the electronic countermeasures that were used more successfully against these drones a year ago. And there's more bells and whistles on them. Did Russia work with Iraq to make Iran to make some of these changes? Probably. There is a factory in Russia that is not just putting out drones, but it's putting out drones that Iran helped them set up. And my suspicion is a lot of gaming has gone into that. And the reason for this is Ukraine's a great test bed. It is Western countries, at least 8 of them that I know of, are testing fairly new weapons in Ukraine because it's a near-peer adversary. And they're not going to get that, like many of you have heard me say before, you can't get that kind of information from testing at Fort Huachuca, you know? You can only get it in a real world situation where the innovation of that battle space has changed so dramatically, almost day to day. Forget about every 6 months. It's just changing dramatically. What better way for Iran and Russia to succeed is by testing that against the best of Western defenses that are deployed in Ukraine. And oh, guess what? If you can defeat those defenses in Ukraine, because I have to say the Ukrainian military has proven itself to be the most dynamic, flexible, and innovative around, if you can defeat them there, then why can't you take those same weapons and deploy them in the Middle East and elsewhere and knock out US military personnel there? So yes, that is going on. I think that Russia would be foolish if they weren't doing the same thing that we're doing in terms of testing out those weapons. And this is, I'll say this to the Trump administration. Putin is not your friend. He will never be your friend. And he is helping Iran figure out new ways to be more lethal against the US military and civilian personnel globally. And I'll leave it with this one last point that I like to say, that no one wakes up in the morning thinking that Vladimir Putin is going to do them a favor, and neither should President Trump.
Quite a last point. I just want to take the moderator's prerogative for a second and expand on, you were talking about the use of Iranian weapons in Ukraine. I know Ambassador Herbst and Luke and I have been in Ukraine ourselves and heard those overhead. But for anyone interested in how this plays out in Ukraine as well, we hosted an event last week that you can find on our website with the Eurasia Center and the Strategic Litigation Project, which presented a newly published report by the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School and the International Partnership for Human Rights, with a legal assessment of Russia's aerial campaign in Ukraine using Iranian weapons, and concluding that it reached the levels of crimes against humanity, of extermination and persecution. So there's plenty on that topic as well. Now, Luke, once again, bringing you back to NATO and the communique, you touched on this, but I just want to expand. We saw President Trump call out Putin at the NATO summit, and Trump agreed to the communique where increased defense expenditures are tied to a threat that Putin poses to NATO countries. We also saw him speak about giving more air defense to Ukraine. You talked about your positive attitude earlier. So can you just say, is Trump's policy evolving, and where would you like it to go?
Yeah, those were notable outcomes of the NATO summit. I mean, in terms of substance, the most notable outcome was the new commitment to 5% of GDP to defense spending between now and 2035. And then there's going to be like a midterm review in 2029, I think, to see how the 32 member states are going. But, you know, maybe, God willing, 33 member states, or maybe, if I get crazy, 34 member states by then. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Like this 5% is key because it does acknowledge the geopolitical reality of the threat posed by Russia, but also I think it's still within the political reality of what the national governments have to face. And this is because they broke it down into 2 chunks for those watching who may not be familiar with this. The old goal was 2% of GDP on defense by each NATO member. Only 23 out of 32 met this goal. Then it moved up to 3.5% for the core defense budget on defense, with another 1.5% of GDP on defense adjacent issues, which I think is entirely appropriate, considering the type of warfare we're facing in the 21st century, because this allows countries that have to invest heavily on things like host nation support, constructing new barracks and bases to receive large numbers of US or British or French troops into Eastern Europe, improving infrastructure, the strength of bridges to hold major, heavy armored vehicles, to move them around. So it helps, funds designed to improve military mobility can be included in this 1.5% part of that 5% of GDP target. But also, it was explicit in the very short but punchy summit declaration that support to Ukraine from a member state can be used to apply towards that 5% goal. So so therefore the summit declaration both explicitly and implicitly recognize the importance of Ukraine, the importance of proper defense investment, and the threat that Russia poses. Now, President Trump himself, during his press conference, we saw that maybe emotional is a bit too strong of a word for President Trump, but he certainly showed, he reacted when a Ukrainian journalist posed the question about, I know it was about air defense, my memory slipping me, it could have been specifically about Patriot missile interceptors. And he was asked, why can't the U.S. provide more of these? And he took, what appeared on camera to be a genuine interest in this journalist's life. Where are you living? Where's your husband? Oh, your husband's fighting in Ukraine. That must be horrible. He took an interest and he said that, he would look into this issue of more interceptors and air defense capabilities. And as John already pointed out, if the Europeans want to pay for it, then, my preference would be America would just provide these. But if the politics in this country don't allow for that, well, let's set up an arrangement where Europe can pay for it. But let's get these much needed capabilities to the Ukrainians as soon as possible. Now, has Trump's views on Ukraine evolved over time? Actually, I think they have. On one hand, it is clear that he doesn't want a geopolitical debacle like we saw with Afghanistan. And I think those around President Trump, and even probably himself, are acutely aware of the political risks of having another geopolitical disaster like Afghanistan, because deep down inside, they each know it could have been them had the election turned out differently in 2020, because they were heading down the same path that Biden also decided to pursue. So I think there's a bit of motivation there to ensure that there is an outcome that doesn't look like Russia has won or got the better of the White House. And I think as the frustration grows with Putin, and we've heard Trump say a few offhand comments. I think he was asked by a journalist on Air Force One, about Iran and Russia, and Trump said, well, Putin called me and asked if he wanted me to, get involved to help him out with Iran. And I said, no, I need you to help me out with yourself. Right now, I think it's consensus in the White House that Putin is the obstacle to peace. Zelensky is the enabler for peace. And the more this goes on, the more this is going to test Trump's patience. But as John said, he's been reluctant to put the hammer down. And all we get are these fortnightly notices that every 2 weeks it's going to be we're going to know if Russia's serious or not. Well, how many of these can you have before you make the conclusion that Putin is not serious for peace? That's the big question. When will President Trump come to this determination that Putin is not a credible actor in these talks?
Thank you. We're going to turn to our final question for the panel portion. And I see some interesting questions coming in over Ask AC and on my X account. If you can send stuff there if you're nice. So submit any questions at askac.org. We'll turn to that shortly, but Ambassador Herbst, to wrap up this portion of this discussion, do you have any final thoughts on everything we've covered?
It's been a wonderful conversation. I think Luke has made the point implicitly that we are now all Trumpologists. You know, Deborah and I are old enough to have spent a fair part of our career as quote unquote Kremlinologists, and we're trying to figure out now where President Trump is going. There are many people who think that he simply is going to sell Ukraine to Putin. I'm not one of those. I think Luke clearly is not as well. There are 2 points that need to be stressed here. Again, what happened in Iran was a triumph for the United States, for Trump's policy, which, if applied also in Ukraine, could have the same impact, albeit without one American soldier or airman being involved in conflict. It's merely a question of providing the weapons and putting down the sanctions that will make sure Putin cannot win in Ukraine. But it's also true, and this is not featured in our conversation, except Deborah's reference to the extraordinary military ingenuity of the Ukrainians, that even with the questions about American support for Ukraine that we've seen since the election, Ukraine is doing a fine job on the battlefield. They have essentially taken back territory around Sumy, even as the Russians have moved somewhat forward, although not much, in Donbass. Although not everywhere in Donbass, because the Ukrainians have taken back Avdiivka. And so the only Russian response has been this massive air campaign. And the one serious complaint I have right now, or criticism I have right now about the administration's policy, is that there's been no reaction to this. The last few nights, we've seen the most massive bombing campaign since the big invasion over nearly 3.5 years ago. 470 strikes, something like. And even before that, there were 300 plus strikes for several weeks. Not a peep out of the president or his team. Luke correctly, as a Trumpologist, noticed the exchange at Trump's presser at the NATO summit between him and the Ukrainian journalist. And he showed a real human sympathy for the horrors that Putin is visiting upon Ukraine. That same sympathy is why Trump took out a third or a half, you can correct me, Clark, of the Syrian Air Force during the first term when Trump put some CW, chemical weapons, on a civilian population. We have yet to see anything comparable here. But the provocations from Putin against the Ukrainian people, and you might say against Trump's own efforts, leads me to see the possibility, not the probability, sadly, that we will see that strong response in Russia's war in Ukraine that we saw after Israel pounded Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we will turn to the audience questions. Let's start with, for you, Luke, on NATO. This is from Sarah Jakes. What did the NATO summit show about the quote unquote health of the alliance? Are things improving since Trump's arrival?
Good question. I think things are just continuing on. Generally healthy, with maybe a few underlying issues that require maintenance, like people get as they age. Let's not forget NATO's 76 years old. So I think overall it's pretty fit. The biggest, let's be frank, I mean, the biggest hiccup at the summit wasn't Donald Trump, it was Spain, which didn't want to get on board with the new 5% of spending benchmark. So NATO had to use, creative wording to show consensus inside the alliance, but allow Spain a little more flexibility and leeway. And of course, President Trump, in a very Trumpian way, made his displeasure known by saying that Spain might have to pay double. But yeah, overall, I think look, you have 32 sovereign states with different interests. Most of the time, these interests will overlap, but not all the time. And in these 32 sovereign states, you have different governments of different political shades. And often inside these governments, you have multi-party coalitions with competing political interests. So putting all this together and getting the outcome we saw at The Hague under the current circumstances, I think that it's NATO's fit and healthy.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, we've got a question from Malcolm War, OBE. He says, what might have been the current situation if the USA had not pulled out of the JCPOA unilaterally?
Well, not to revisit what could have been, I will say if one looks at the IAEA, which is a trusted multilateral body that the U.S. across administrations has worked with, assessments coming out of there were not favorable toward Iran meeting its commitment when the JCPOA was still a living agreement. IAEA assessments, as well as our own U.S. Title 50 intelligence assessments, informed the decision to pull out of the JCPOA. So I think one could look at it as if one's talking about what if Tehran had actually met its commitments that had been laid out in that agreement. So I think what gets lost sometimes in the looking back at the what if it had been maintained or what have you is really looking at why the U.S. pulled out. It wasn't just a pick to remove that agreement. It was informed, and so I would say look past the cacophony of the United States walking away from that and really looking at how that decision was informed. And so the two things I could say in an open forum is that there were intelligence assessments that informed that decision, but multilaterally, the United States was informed by the IAEA as well.
Thank you. Deborah, question from Kevin Monroe. Since the NATO summit, has there been any substantive progress toward European cruise missiles going to Ukraine?
What kind of cruise missiles? I'm kind of baffled by the question. Are you talking about ground launched, air launched? I don't understand the question, and so I am trying to figure out what the nature of the question is and what is the launching vehicle that they're talking about. So that would be my comeback. But so because you made the mistake of calling on me. I'm just going to pipe up to what Clark said. Look, the Iranians have learned well from the Russian teachers. They lie and cheat as well as the Russians do. My overall question is not just what NATO is willing to provide, because NATO countries, the EU, countries in the Pacific have provided a huge number of sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. And along with Ukrainian ingenuity, they've been using these weapons in new and inventive ways that we hadn't even fathomed. And I think that's an important point. But my question goes back to what Luke was saying and what John was saying, and I was biting my tongue because I don't know how much higher the Ukrainian death count has to be before Trump wakes up and says this is enough. Every day, Vladimir Putin, working with the Iranians, makes these weapons so much more deadly. And let's be honest, they're going after civilian targets. There's no aiming at military targets. They hit a dormitory, which was filled with young women. Tell me how that's a military target. And my question is, what's the break point? What's the break point for the Trump administration of how many Ukrainians have to die, along with the help of your pals, the Iranians, who you've already stated you're not fond of? How many of them have to die before Trump says, Vlad, this isn't working out for me. And I think the question that should be asked is not what the Europeans are necessarily providing, but there should be a question of what the US is willing to provide, and is it willing to continue to provide anything at all? I had to get that off my chest, sorry.
That's fair. Thank you. All right, Ambassador Herbst, question for you from Marco Robinson. He says, many criticized Trump's Iran strikes and stressed diplomacy was not given a fair chance. How do you respond to this criticism? Is diplomacy being given a fair chance with Russia and Ukraine?
Regarding Iran, I think there's been diplomacy since the JCPOA was negotiated back almost over 10 years ago. And we saw the report by the IAEA regarding Iran not acting consistently with that agreement and getting close to establishing a nuclear weapon. So diplomacy was tried. Regarding Ukraine, diplomacy has been tried since Russia began this war over 11 years ago. You had this whole Minsk process. You had Minsk I and Minsk II. And we saw then that Moscow was not interested in peace. The only peace they were willing to accept then as now is their effective control over Ukrainian national security policy. Now they want effective control over Ukrainian policy in all respects. Anyone who studies international relations knows that diplomacy does not exist in a vacuum. Negotiations to be successful have to have the right context. And the right context means that to achieve your goals through diplomacy, you have to be in a position that your enemy cannot achieve its goals by military means. The Biden team, intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats, never provided the weapons in sufficient quantity or quality to give Ukraine an edge on the battlefield that could have enabled successful diplomacy. Sadly, while Trump has outlined a reasonable objective to achieve a durable peace, he has not implemented that objective in a sensible fashion. Since Putin has made clear his desire is not peace in Ukraine, it's to have effective political control, Trump, if he really wants to achieve his goal of a durable peace, has to bring the hammer down on the Kremlin. You are not going to sweet talk Putin into giving up his objectives. You have to show him that there are very serious consequences to defying President Trump. We have not seen the same strength of purpose towards Russian aggression from this administration that we've seen towards Iran's desires for desires for conquest or control in the Middle East. But I still think there's a reasonable chance we will see that, but we haven't seen it yet.
Thank you. All right, Luke, a question from Max Moore. He says, the US strikes on Iran seem to shake up the GOP. Is this the case for additional sanctions against Russia or providing more weapons to Russia? Maybe you mean Ukraine. How is Republican support evolving for Ukraine?
Well, polling consistently shows wide skepticism of Russia amongst self-identified Republican voters, and relatively strong support for Ukraine. I mean, depending on how you ask the question, if you ask a poll asking a self-identified Republican, do you support Ukraine? You're going to get a sizable majority. If you ask them, should we arm Ukraine or fund Ukraine, then that's when the number decreases. But even this, phrasing the polling question like this, you still find around 45 to 55% of Republicans support even arming Ukraine. And 3 years into this war, this is very much our support for Ukraine is very much viewed as a Biden administration initiative. So show me another area in American politics where you have 45 to 55% of Republicans supporting what was essentially a Biden administration initiative. So I think across the country, there's still wide support amongst American conservatives for Ukraine, strong skepticism for Russia, and the noise, the very vocal crowd inside the MAGA movement who are more isolationists, or even some of the so-called prioritizers who think we should prioritize everything towards the Indo-Pacific. This is a very small minority. They're very loud, vocal, very online, but not in the mainstream, in my opinion. And you saw, well, I saw a poll before the week before Trump launched the strikes on Iran. This said it was like 91% of Republicans supported attacking Iran, which just blew my mind, right? That this perhaps that number is not precisely 9, but it was in that ballpark. And so it just shows that while we often get frustrated with European partners trying to handle coalition management, our government, we have coalition management that has to take place. President Trump is no different. President Biden was no different. They're managing a coalition inside their own movements. And I wouldn't let the very vocal isolationists disproportionately overshadow or drown out the more mainstream thinking when it comes to America's role in the world.
Thanks, Luke. To our audience, if you are going to send in commentary that you think you disagree with us in the future, you should list your name rather than anonymous. I'll leave that one and go with someone who listed their name. Feel free to flag me if you want to answer this question to our panel. I'm not sure who wants this. What could Russia potentially stand to benefit from the current situation in the Middle East, and what are the potential negative effects for the Kremlin? All right, Ms. Kagan.
So I think the fear that I have, the concern that I have, is that President Trump will be convinced that Putin has something to offer on Iran. And I think it'll. I mean, in the past, one of the most wretched parts of the JCPOA, from my perspective, other than it did not provide for any semblance of monitoring that we would have demanded from any U.S. negotiator in agreement with Russia or China. I would have been slapped out of my job if I had offered something that weak, all the times that I was negotiating with Russia. So, but Putin was supposed to be, Russia was supposed to be the guarantor of that agreement, was supposed to be the guarantor that it would provide fuel assemblies for the commercial nuclear reactors, it would take back the enriched uranium, etc. And that's sort of like trusting the fox to guard the hen house, from my perspective. And my concern, and my overriding concern, is that Putin will make another offer to Trump saying, I can help you with this negotiation with Iran. And the way I'm going to help you is I'll deal with this enrichment issue. I'll, give them the already made fuel assemblies, and I'll monitor that enrichment for them, et cetera, to make sure it doesn't go above 3.4 to 4.2%, which, is what a commercial reactor would use. So I do have this, I do think that this could be really a huge problem if Trump is convinced that his pal Putin can help him out here, because there's absolutely no way that Putin is going to be able to provide any level of confidence to any smart person watching this that that's exactly what's going to happen. 20 years ago, would Russia take back that fissile material and put it in a commercial reactor, blend it down? Yeah, that's just has not been in the cards for at least 15 or 18 years now.
Thank you. We're almost at time. Oh, Ambassador Herbst, final word.
I think Deborah's concern is legitimate, but I think one reason why that will not happen is if Trump does that, he will find his inner John Kerry, who was played by the Russians. They offered help on Syria if we would be helpful to them on Ukraine. And Kerry, of course, was very weak opposing the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I suspect if Trump were tempted in that direction, this very nasty historical example would dissuade him from proceeding.
Okay, fair is fair. Mr. Cooper, Mr. Coffey, any final word? Mr. Cooper, and then Mr.
I
Coffey.
want to amen the John Kerry reference, because yes, and one could probably safely assess that that has actually maybe been referenced more than once in the interagency. I'll end with this. At the NATO summit, there's already been discussion about the shift in tone and posture by the president. Luke made reference to the exchange the president had with the Ukrainian reporter and the discussion about Patriot capabilities being brought to Ukraine for air defense. We do remember that some of the final words that came out of the president's mouth were Vladimir Putin, quote, Vladimir Putin really has to end the war. People are dying at levels that people haven't seen for in a long time. That was a clear call. And then there were references to actually giving credit and credence to the Ukrainian people, their capabilities, and Zelensky himself. Yes, I think the president at this point sees Putin differently, and is less likely to be swayed or sold a rotten bill of goods. But yeah, I think the Kerry example resonates with many who are currently serving the administration, and has definitely been cited and probably will be cited again.
Thank you. And Luke, over to you.
Just a quick final observation. We can't forget that these issues, whether it's Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, they're all interconnected, as the title of today's event shows, and policymakers just cannot think they can just focus on one and at the expense of the others. It's time that we finally start seeing this joined up threat for what it is.
That's an excellent last point. Thank you so much to our panel. You covered a lot, very interesting. And thank you to our audience.